welcome everybody, and thank you again for returning. Fisher mentioned there at the outset this business of the difficulty in reading Hegel, and I really implore you to go easy on yourselves, because there are Hegel scholars who, when dissecting the phenomenology of spirit, in particular, come along and say, when they encounter certain passages or chapters, now, well, I'm not going to deal with this because it's just too complex. Now, these are Hegel scholars. So the fact that you can, that you're having difficulty, or some of you may be having difficulty, is quite natural. In fact, if you couldn't read beyond the first page of Hegel, that's quite natural, and that's what I'm here for. One other thing that was brought up last week by Sophia is the question of the distinction between Kant and Hegel regarding, using my analogy of Mozart and Beethoven. And she asked me to elaborate a bit on that, and I will at the beginning, because it will lead nicely into today's discussion. I made the distinction because, for me, Kant is an elegant, pristine, systematic writer, like Mozart, in the sense that they accumulated all the various styles of the vernacular, the musical vernacular, the philosophical vernacular, and they both trimmed them down to size, as it were, and made them so pristine and so elegant that they spoke to the human heart in a way that was inconceivable heretofore. Beethoven and Hegel, as I mentioned last week, born in the same year, aren't pristine at all. They aren't elegant. Hegel calls himself a systematician, but he's, if you're coming at him from the outside in, he's barely systematic at all, as you can see. And likewise with Beethoven. Again, they build on Kant and Mozart respectively, but they do something very different. They take music and philosophy in a direction that it has never gone before. Kant and Mozart did not do that. They stayed within the parameters of the history of music and the history of philosophy. Beethoven and Hegel break those bounds. They seem to be everywhere, all over the place, as it were. And yet there is a majesty and a nobility, both at the heart of what Beethoven writes and what composes and what Hegel writes. For example, the pieces most admired by Roger Scruton, Beethoven's late quartets, for example, for many aren't pretty. They certainly aren't anything that you would ever hear coming out of Mozart. They can be harsh. They're dissonant in many ways, and yet there's a majesty and a life-affirming impulse at the heart of them. There's a nobility at their core, and likewise with Hegel's writings. What seems to be everywhere and all over the place, and scattered, does something that was inconceivable in the history of philosophy. And that is, it totally detaches us from 3,000 years of categories and concepts that guided the subject. It does something new and different. And that's what I was trying to get you to think of last week as you move through Hegel. Do not think of him being trapped in the old dualisms. Don't try and impose, the categories handed down to us from Plato to Kant. Don't try and impose them on him, because it won't work. Just as you wouldn't impose, the musical style of Thomas Tallis on a Beethoven. It just wouldn't work. And that's not to take away from Thomas Tallis, who happens to be my favorite composer. I'm just saying that they are so remarkably different that it would do them both a disservice. Now, the main thing that I want to talk about today, of course, is the Phenomenology of Spirit, but which is the magnum opus, if you like, that Hegel offers us. But I want you to see that it's founded upon everything that we said last week. You cannot understand the Phenomenology of Spirit, and indeed you cannot understand any of Hegel, unless you understand this, that the categories no longer, as in Kant, are static. They're not timeless, they're not universal, they're not set. And this is what primarily distinguishes Kant from Hegel, in that there is nothing for Hegel's categories to correspond to. Once you do away with this notion of this unknowable or this thing in itself, then the categories are free to swing where they will, to go where they will. It's why we call Hegel a historicist. The first thinker to allow history to have its way with conceptual thinking. And that in itself is a major innovation. A major innovation. So when you think now of what Hegel is going to do in this book, have in mind always that it's not a subject trying to come to grips with an external object or objective world over and above the categories of consciousness. And this is crucial for your understanding. It'll all click into place once you get this. It's a subject trying to come to terms with the categories of consciousness. Okay? And that will be seen more explicitly as we go through. But let's begin with the very simple and basic question, which I alluded to last week. This is called the Phenomenology of Spirit. We know what phenomenology means. It means, the study of how things appear to us, how they show up. This is a phenomenology of spirit. It's a phenomenology of consciousness. It's a phenomenology of Geist. It's a phenomenology of mind. We can all, they're interchangeable. So this is not a phenomenology of things or objects. We're not looking at how things appear. This is a phenomenology of consciousness or spirit, how spirit appears, how spirit or consciousness shows up in and through our experience. What is spirit? We said it's consciousness, it's mind, it's Geist in the German. It's a very loaded term. But for the purposes of making this very explicit, think of it as character. Think of it as something which allows one to identify with something other than itself, which permits it to identify with something other than itself. You say of something it has great spirit, you know, that the child has great spirit, let's say. The football team has great spirit. What you're saying is the football team or the child have great character. They possess a kind of especially in the case of teams, let's say, a kind of a general disposition that demarcates them or distinguishes them from the rest. We could call it personality, as it were. Pushing it even further, we could say self-knowledge. They have self-assurance. Or the child has great self-assurance, self-confidence. So the basic point is, and that'll become again more explicit as we go through, the basic point at the moment is that what we are perceiving, what we're trying to get at, is not objects which we have dealt with the last week in Hegel. We are dealing now with confronting consciousness. And the surprising and wonderful thing about this work and all of Hegel's work, and this relates it directly to those with conservative instincts, is that our knowledge of the world is therefore, because it's knowledge of consciousness, is therefore self-knowledge. What we come to know will be ourselves. What was initially distinct and divided with all these dualisms that Hegel eradicated through his critique of Kant are going to be overcome. The self is going to, or the subject, or whatever you want to call it, is going to begin in a state, this famous word that Hegel introduces into philosophy, this in a state of alienation, and will wind towards, in various phases, towards full self-consciousness. Alienation will give way to freedom. Estrangement will give way to full self-recognition. Division will give way to full self-consciousness or identity. The goal of the phenomenology is to move from alienation, pure estrangement from everything and everyone, to full self-knowledge, full self-recognition, full self-acquaintance. Alienation implies being bound to something. Therefore, the objective is to twist free of what you are being bound to or being bound by in order to experience freedom. Not liberty, as in license to do what you want, but freedom, a negotiated freedom, a mediated freedom, mediated by others, mediated by the institutions of social life and so forth. In other words, what we would generally call in this group conservative freedom. A freedom that is willing to acknowledge the existence of others and abide by the fact that we coexist with them, and therefore our freedom is curtailed. As I often say and have said before on this platform with others, you know, the freedom begins where duty and responsibility ends. Freedom presupposes duty and responsibility, but more of that on another occasion. Now, let's begin from the very basics. At the outset of life, because the phenomenology of spirit is the story of an individual life, but it's also the story of civilization. It's also the story of particular historical epochs. And that's why next week we will go on to discuss history, Hegel's view of history in more detail, and indeed his view of art and religion. For all of these are drawn into the sphere of consciousness. You cannot understand yourself without understanding all of these elements of our experience. And again, the first philosopher to so do, to draw all of these things. Most philosophers pare away culture. They pare away history. They pare away religion. They pare away art. But they don't, in order to reach that point where it's you get down to the raw, pure, abstract relationship between self and world, or between subject and object. It's what Husserl, a later phenomenologist, would say that that's all of that stuff is part of the natural attitude. The natural attitude. And in order to understand the world in itself, or to bring us back, as he said, to the things themselves, we must bracket all that stuff out. Hegel won't hear of that, because the very thing that makes us who we are is that. The very thing that makes us what we are is that. Selves are composed of culture, comprised of art, religion, philosophy, history, theology, beauty. But at the very beginning, when we all start out in life, or when civilizations start out, or when countries and nations start out, they don't have that sense. They are not self-conscious at all. They are conscious, which is why the immediate element of experience in the phenomenology is consciousness. We all start out conscious, but an animal is conscious, but it's not self-conscious. It doesn't reflect on its own being conscious. It doesn't ask the question of being. It doesn't stand back from its own immediate predicament and question why it's here, what it should do. Is it free? Is it not free? What can I be? Animals don't ask that question, therefore animals are not free. They are driven by inclination. They are determined by instinct. No self, no freedom. Self equals freedom. Self-consciousness equals freedom. No self, no freedom. Consciousness, no freedom. You're conscious. Being conscious does not imply being self-conscious. And it's only when you are self-conscious that you will acquire that inward disposition to stand back from your immediacy and see where can you go from here, or what can you do now. This brings us back to what we said last week, that Hegel is the antithesis of Rousseau. If Rousseau says man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains, Hegel tells us that we are born in chains, and our purpose is to become free. There's nothing more dependent than the child. Now, the child's cry is what I call in my book, Moral Matters, that the howl of homelessness. The child identifies with nothing and no one. It's pure immediacy. That's not freedom. The child is dependent on its parents and on society and on its surrounds for everything. It's a totally dependent creature, totally unfree, totally alienated. The goal, as I'm saying to you now, of Hegel's phenomenology is to bring you from that point to the point where you are independent, free. Independence being the antithesis of alienation. But Mark, the child, and we'll see this again when we turn to history and religion and art next week, the child faces a world which seems totally objective, totally frightening, totally other, totally threatening. Now, by the way, you can read the Phenomenology of Spirit as an adult, but you are reading about your own experience. No matter what stage in life you're at, you're reading about your own development, as I'll explain momentarily. Now, it may not be your development as Dick Coleman or Barry Cameron or Durdian or whatever. No, it may not be that. But in a sense, it is that. It may not be the experience of proper named individuals, but it is your experience nonetheless, because you belong to a community whose experience it most certainly is. But we can all identify with this. We can all identify with that state of dividedness, that state of alienation. And it's a state of unknowing. The child doesn't know anything, just as the formative stage of the Phenomenology of Spirit, consciousness, doesn't know anything. In his philosophical mode, in his philosophical language, that is, at the beginning of the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel talks about sense certainty. That raw, immediate givenness of experience to the human mind, where we take things for granted. We take things that, before you do philosophy, let's say, or before you think about these things, you believe that there are objects which are over and above the human mind, that the subject is divided from the object, that they are separate entities. You don't think about, consciousness creating or constructing the world through the categories. You don't think about that. And that's why it's so counterintuitive. You believe that what we receive through the senses is truth. Of course, much philosophy since Hegel, and beginning with Hegel, has disputed that. Nearly all serious philosophers have. It's called the myth of the given, as Sellers would call it. Why is that? According to Hegel, at least. And Hegel sets the tone then for all subsequent thinking in this direction. Because there is no way to think about, describe, talk about, or articulate in any sense what it is that you're receiving through the senses without bringing it under universal categories. It simply can't be done. And once you do, once you start describing and classifying whatever it is that's coming in through the senses, then you're no longer dealing with raw data, raw empirical data. You are dealing with the stuff of the world being shaped, classified, explained through categories of the understanding that can be communicated to others in knowledge. But it's certainly not raw data. In other words, there's no immediate knowledge of the world. The child, you could say, as the newborn child has immediate knowledge of the world, but that's not knowledge. That's a mere confrontation between a mind and the world, which results in no reflection, no knowledge, nothing. It's only when the process of consciousness gets underway that we begin to start to form our identity, that we begin to understand what the self is, that we begin the long march from alienation to freedom. Think of a child again. We don't teach a child to know the world at the formative stages. The child goes on its own process or its own adventure of self-discovery. He sees the world as alienating or as alien, as threatening, as distinct. And thus there is fear. And all of these emotions are spread across with frightening alacrity across the phenomenology of spirit. Emotions that we have all felt, and emotions, by the way, that people have used and turned into theories that have become industries. And yet there they are, shining luminously from the pages of the Phenomenology of Spirit, without all the garbage and baggage of 200 years of industries which have only served to further alienate people from themselves rather than reuniting people to themselves, which could very easily have been done had all of that not happened, and they stuck to the original text or the original word on this. But however, the child goes out into the world. Every child goes out into the world and encounters the world by itself. And what does it do? It plays. It structures. It builds. It does things that we don't want it to do. Overturns the flower pot. Digs its hand into the soil. I always use the image of the child playing with the blocks, building, shaping, molding. What is happening there? This is not mere incoherent, engagement with the world. This is the first stab at trying to understand the self, a self in potentia, trying to understand or to become a self in actuality. It's shaping and molding the world in its own self-image. It's not trying to get any closer to reality as it is in itself. Consciousness is not in those moments mirroring nature, because what the child is doing is projecting itself onto the world. And what we're left with is a shape or a design or a mess or whatever it is, which reflects the conscious intention of the child. Now, it's not self-conscious, but the child intends to do something by grappling, by making, by throwing, and the next day, when it has its little designs or whatever it has left there in the Lego or whatever, it will return to it. And suddenly it will begin the discovery of identity. It will recognize itself in the object. Otherwise, it wouldn't return to it. It wouldn't, make give the little shriek of contentment and point to the thing, or take the thing up and shake it and look at its father for acknowledgement. Thus, in the object we find not a pure object. We find the consciousness of the child. The child derives its consciousness in and through its confrontation with the object. The object derives its identity in and through its engagement with, and through its confrontation, as it were, with the child. We start the process that we all take for granted, that we identify objects as belonging to people, things belonging to people, reflections of themselves, reflections of their intentions, reflections of their consciousness, reflections of who they are. The most poignant example of this, of course, as always, is in the moment of absence, when we see things that remind us of others who have been or who are and are just absent. We don't see things, we don't see raw data, we see them. And we will never distinguish those things from who they belong to or whose they are. We see them, we smell them, and in and through those things, we unite with them. They were hers, they were his, and you cling them tight to the person. You cling to them tight. And so it is with the children too. You know, we were discussing here the other day about what we have retained, the memorabilia that belong to our children, the little things. They are, for the ordinary observer, they are things, objects. But no, they are instantiations of selfhood. They are mirrors. They mirror. When we look at them, we don't, you know, our consciousness isn't mirroring something in the natural world. We are looking at consciousness. It's consciousness mirroring consciousness. When I look at them, I see another person. The child's development doesn't stop there, of course. The child develops and goes through phases of consciousness, just as civilizations go through phases of consciousness, just as world history goes through phases of consciousness. And what drives that? If it's not correspondence to the external world, as we discussed last week, what is it? What's the criterion that triggers a change from one phase of consciousness to another? What drives history, in other words? What drives the phases of consciousness in the Phenomenology of Spirit? 2 words: desire and recognition. Desire and recognition. Oh yes, my friends, long before Freud was ever thought of, Hegel was talking about desire and recognition. And do you say to yourself then, when you bring yourself back to the beginning of this talk, when I said Hegel is doing something like Beethoven that was never done before? Never done before. Because now we are discussing tangible, personal feelings that we all have, and he's conceptualizing them. He's putting them in play as philosophical concepts. What does the child desire? The child desires to become free. The child desires to overcome its bondage. This child desires to overcome its dependence through self-recognition in the world. So every time it goes out into the world, it's trying to grapple with it, to shape it, so that it becomes more familiar. Once again, the world is not given in any raw sense. It's not confronting raw objects. Again, it appears like that, which is why Hegel, as I say, in the more philosophical moments of the early phases of the phenomenology, talks philosophy stricto sensu. When we perceive things as being distinct from us. But that, again, is all within consciousness, as I said in my reply to Patrick that was sent to each one of you. It's what Hegel calls the thing in itself, or the object, for consciousness. It's not distinct from consciousness. We begin by believing that it is and find out that it isn't through our experience. But look at what happens every time as maturity sets in and as experience unfolds. And every time the subject, as the child, goes out into the world or confronts the world, what happens? More of the world starts to take on its image and likeness, the child's image and likeness. It's no longer the parent's image and likeness. Suddenly, the walls, the place, the home begins to reflect the consciousness of the child. You often hear the expression, oh, well, he has to experiment. He's coming to an age. He needs to find himself. Oh, these are all Hegelian phrases. They're just dressed up for contemporary ears. You are finding yourself to a degree. But the more the world begins to reflect you and your consciousness, the more free you become. The more independence is beginning to be established. Alienation is being conquered by this. Familiarity and unity is being realized. And what is happening? The child is dying to itself. It's grappling with other things in the first instance. And then it's coming back to itself with an augmented sense of self, an augmented sense of identity, and an increased self-awareness. The child is the thesis. It goes out, it dies to itself, goes towards something that's different or other, the antithesis. Through engagement with that thing, through mediation with that thing, there is a third, a new consciousness, a new level of self-consciousness. The desire propelled me, the thesis, to go out to the antithesis, to what is other, threatening, different, alien, non-identity. It's the Trinitarian logic that I spoke of last week in Hegel's dialectics. The Father dies to himself in the Son. The Son becomes one with the world and is cancelled in the crucifixion, but rises in the Spirit, comes back to the Father, renewed, a different thing. It's now something different. It's a different God. And that process, driven by desire for what? Self-recognition. Every time the self is no longer satisfied with its current state in life, it will go out again. It will desire to know more, to become more acquainted with the world. And that means it will desire self-recognition. It desires, the forms of consciousness only break down through dissatisfaction with one's current state of self-recognition. Now, all the while, you see what's happening is one is becoming free, free from that original state of alienation, free from dependence, free from bondage. What's happening here is self-determination. And all the while, to repeat, because this you must get, consciousness is not mirroring nature. It's not getting closer to how things are in themselves. It's mirroring consciousness. So the dialectic is unfolding now through this desire for self-recognition. And all the while, the world is becoming more a home. By the time the child is in the teens, the world is speaking volumes about who he is or who she is, what they like, what they desire. The character of the child is everywhere evident as it breaks free of those constraints which held it in bondage. And on it goes. Of course, there are selves which become stuck, imprisoned, stultified, and do not move, just like there are nations that do not move, as we'll see next week. That are satisfied, seemingly, with self-recognition of a primitive form. But of course, the problems that beset such places and such civilizations and such nations are indicative of why they need to move, why they need to change, why they are not free. There comes a stage, of course, in a child's life when the objects no longer, although they are confirming and affirming his identity, no longer satisfy. Now the child needs the affirmation or the desire of other desiring beings for full acceptance, full recognition. Hegel's Master and Slave is a psychological drama of majestic quality, insofar as it's something we all experience and have experienced. It's the birth pangs of the self. Every child that enters into the company of another, there's always those tentative stages where, wariness, sometimes even conflict for self-recognition. Sometimes violence of the worst sort. I've seen it in my own children when visitors have come. The visitor, knowing that he doesn't recognize anything of himself in and through the home that he's just entered, and certainly not in and through the child he's encountered, takes up something and throws it at the child whose home it is. And it ends up with parents apologizing to one another for the behavior of their children, because in and through them, their child acquires their identity. Therefore, at least at the early stages, therefore, and we learn more about this when we could do family, civil society, and state, and the philosophy of right. And therefore, it reflects badly on the parents. The parents think that the other parents perceive them as being violent. Oh, I'm dreadfully sorry for Johnny's behavior. He never does that at home. I don't know what came over him, all this stuff. And it's an attempt to appease the judgments that are made about what? Oneself, the character of the people that are coming in. But this is what's happening in The Master and Slave. There's this attempt to a fight to the death, a struggle to the death, a life and death struggle, as Hegel calls it, for self-recognition. Because I desire the desire of the other, but I know if I die to myself in the usual dialectical mode and go out to the other, I could be killed. I could lose my identity entirely. So it leaves the dialectic in a bit of a quandary. Because I also know that if I kill the other, or if I subjugate the other, I will lose the very thing that I need for self-affirmation and recognition. Both parties realize this, of course, and eventually one of them backs down, agrees to become the slave of the master. But of course, as usual with Hegel, things are not what they seem. Because the mastery of the slave, the master of the slave is only master by virtue of having the slave. And for those who wish to understand this, I did give in the first of my lectures on fools, frauds, and firebrands, which are on the Foundation's website, I gave a description of the master and slave. I won't go into detail with it here again, but suffice to say that there would be no master if there wasn't a slave. The master's identity is bound up entirely with the slave. But the slave's is also bound up entirely with the master. I cannot be a slave without having a master. I cannot be a master without having a slave. That's most basic. But the master is not master of the slave because the slave master is dependent upon the slave. And what you're dependent upon, you cannot have full mastery over. You're in some way enslaved to it. And indeed, for Hegel, the slave is even more free than the master, because the master has an illusory freedom. He finds his freedom in and through what the slave does for him. Meanwhile, the slave is grappling with the world, shaping the world, cooking the world in his own image and likeness, tailoring the gardens, making the food, cleaning the silver, and all the while identifying with it and shaping the world in his own image and likeness. He may be still bound to the master, but at the most important level, he is free. The world is his own, where the master sees nothing of himself, except in a kind of Lacanian way, kind of like an imago, the mirror stage of existence, where in his baubles and in his silver, he sees only his dim reflection. By the time we reach adulthood, of course, the world has been so totally recognized, as it were, that we don't think about it. We move freely in it. Everything that we touch, everything that we have reflects ourselves and is at our disposal. Totally shaped in our own image and likeness. Nothing confronts us that is alien. And if it does, the dialectical process gets underway again and is soon subdued through the categories of consciousness. All the while, the world is becoming more recognizable. All the while, the world is becoming a mirror through which we see ourselves. Because remember, what's happening with the child isn't confronting a world that is in its purity. What the child confronts is a world that's already made, shaped through consciousness. It thinks it's going out into a world or confronting objects as if for the first time. But no, those objects have already been shaped by consciousness. preceding consciousness, Geist, they already contain, the world already contains, as I once said to a gang of Scrutonians or Scrutopians, whatever way you want to call yourselves, in a session with Roger many years ago, the world is always already spiritualized in that sense. For all the reasons, again, that I gave you in the response to Patrick. And this is why, when the journey of the phenomenology is a journey of, as Hegel says, recollection. Recollection. What does he mean by that? A journey of memory. Now, it's not anamnesis in the sense of Plato, where you're recalling something from a previous existence. The true sphere of the forms, as it were, in Hegel, in Plato, rather. You are quite literally recollecting yourself from the world. What self? Spirit. The world as shaped by your forebears. Hegel calls it elsewhere social substance. So when you go out into the world and you die to yourself in order to engage with it, it is already shaped by the concepts and the conceptions of previous generations. You're not grappling with an object. You're not grappling with raw data. You're grappling with knowledge. You're trying to, everything, you see, everything is shaped and ordered and classified. It seems alien to you, but all you're doing is becoming one with those classifications, making them your own, such as knowledge. So when we want to understand anything, we don't go to the thing as such, we go to the history of the thing in our textbooks, in our history books, in our scientific books. And there we find a history. Once again, we die to ourselves, we engage with the material, and we come back enhanced with knowledge. Our self is expanded. And something that was alien or abstruse or different or other has now become the same. The identity of identity and non-identity. The union of being and otherness. I die to myself so that I can become one with another. We die, both of us, we become a third. You enter the book, you enter Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, an unknown and alien thing, it seems, but you come back from it, out of it, enlarged in spirit, enlarged in self-consciousness. And what we call our world is that, is the self-consciousness of others. It's the drama of others. It's the categories of others, the conceptions of others. Which is why Hegel believes that you cannot understand the world unless you understand everything historically. If you can't get to the object in its purity, the best you can do, and all you can do, And that's not to downgrade it in any way, because it's far better than an unknowable thing in itself. If you've taken the idealistic turn, or the idealist turn, which both Hegel and Scruton and Kant have, is to go through those various configurations of consciousness to see or to confront spirit. So what you're doing is you're not confronting an alien world, although it seems that way. Remember, the being in itself, or the thing in itself, or the object in itself for consciousness. There's already preceding you a whole conceptual framework, a whole conceptual network, a conceptual scheme, as it were. Which is why when you are engaging with it, when you're understanding your world, you're understanding yourself, because you are another. The French philosopher Paul Ricoeur has this wonderful saying, oneself as another. Hegel puts it, the I that is we and the we that is I. I am formed by the background, the horizon, the conceptual horizon into which I am born. Bradley, the Hegelian and conservative, the British conservative thinker, puts it like this, that from the moment of birth, the chains of custom and tradition begin to surround you. So if we are born in chains, it is those chains. And we wear them lightly. My yoke is easy, my burden light. And that's what we mean when we say self-understanding, self-knowledge is knowledge of the world and vice versa. It's also what we mean when we say that conceptual revolutions do not happen in response to getting closer to the world as it is in itself. Neither are they driven by material considerations, such as in Marx. They are driven by changes in concepts. Every time we have a revolution of sorts, not a revolution of the nasty type, just a change, a complete change, and we'll explore this greater and finer detail next week. It's because somebody or some people thought differently. They changed their minds. And what happened? The shape of the world changed. Just as when the child changes its mind, quite literally changes its mind, the shape of the world changes. The shape of its world changes. And it's not an arbitrary change of mind or change of heart. It's an attempt, again, a struggle for further self-recognition in the world, an attempt to see oneself further in the world, an attempt to be free. Free of alienation, free of bondage, free of that sense that there's some part of experience that is occluded or obscure or divided from you. It's an attempt to be fully at home in the world. And it's a mediation through, a dialectical mediation through the consciousness of others, the culture of others, the bequest of tradition, culture, art, religion, all of it reveal the world as it truly is, the only way it can be for us humans. So conceptual revolutions do not happen again by chance, or if they do, a lot of them are inauthentic, for want of a better word, such as the French Revolution, which, by the way, was a necessity in many ways for Hegel, but was an absolute disaster, which Hegel foretold. Only two people foretold that dramatically, and that was Burke and Hegel. He said the untamed freedom of the French Revolution would inevitably end in terror and death and genocide, which of course it did. Because once you take away the institutions which mediate that freedom, then it's a fight to the death. So, and this will help those thinking about Marx in this context. The reason, two reasons. One, that material forces are not the drivers of conceptual revolutions is one, because it doesn't deal in concepts. It has denied idealism, even though it depended on it for its birth and its initial legitimacy. It's a materialism, which is why its people are never free, but always enslaved. Which is why its people can never think for themselves or are told what to think. Which is why there is no self-recognition as such. Which is why the people are always in a state of alienation and bondage and enslavement. Yearning to be set free. And once they are, what happens? The dialectic swings into place and the cultural superstructure becomes the mediating force. And secondly, it is spirit or the character or the conceptual framework which determines what we think is or what we think of as technology. Whatever the conceptual framework is, whatever this, to use Hegelian jargon, whatever the spiritual framework is, that will shape our world, and thus it will shape our reasoning vis-a-vis technology. It won't be that raw, crude sense that Marx suggested it had. Hegel said the real is the rational is the real. He could have said the real is consciousness is the real. For it's only when we align ourselves, when we come to terms with the fact that that is who we are and what we are, and that self-discovery is a discovery of others and how they have shaped the world in their own image and likeness, only then will we come home to it. Only then will we find our place and rest contentedly therein.